Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on another edition of Wednesday Night in the Word. I'm your host, as usual, Jade Alvarado, and tonight we will be actually sitting down with Matt Swart, a good friend of mine. How are you doing?
I'm good, Jade. How are you doing tonight?
Good. So this book tonight that we're going to be covering and doing a little overview on is called Ecclesiastes, right?
Yes, that's right.
I know it's one of your favorite books in the Bible, right?
Absolutely.
It's definitely an interesting one for those who haven't read it. It's only 12 chapters. We're going to just be going over kind of an overview of it tonight. It's funny, when I first went to go read this book, I was so scared. I was like, oh my goodness, like I've heard not horror stories, but like it's heavy.
Yeah,
and
that's a good word.
After reading it, yeah, it's definitely something that it kind of takes a toll on you in some type of way. And yeah, I'm excited to sit down and kind of dive into it a little bit tonight. Do remember that this is a live Bible study, so you guys can comment or give us any questions, and we will try to have Matt answer some of them for you. Okay, so I guess without further ado, if you want to tell us a little bit about Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, so, we're going to go with the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to go to the question of the week
Yeah,
first?
I thought that.
Yeah, no worries. So, the question of the week was, is life meaningless? So we got a couple responses. Ricky Vetter says, with so many leading meaningful lives, I'd say no. And I saw that and I was like, well, what does meaningful lives really look like to you? What does that mean? What is a really meaningful life, you know? But my favorite response was from Deborah Conklin, and she said, Ecclesiastes presents us with a naturalistic vision of life, one that sees life through distinctively human eyes, but ultimately recognizes the rule and reign of God in the world, which I thought was awesome. Like, that was a great response. Thank you for writing that in.
Absolutely.
So, I guess I want to pose that question to you, I guess. Is life meaningless?
You know, that's really what we're going to try to find out tonight. And
Okay.
I do really appreciate Ricky's comment in, I think that idea is something that we're really going to be able to go through tonight. And I would, Ricky, if you were watching, as well as anybody else who has sympathized with that sentiment, I would advise you to keep your ears open and your minds engaged, that we might be able to answer that question tonight of what does define a meaningless life. I suppose to answer your question myself, Jade, I would posit that life is not meaningless. However, I would argue that the way that many live their lives is meaningless.
Okay. All
That
right.
it doesn't have to be, but it often is.
Gotcha.
We'll explore that tonight.
All right, let's do it.
Yes, that's right. And thank you, Debbie, for that response too. Both of the topics you've mentioned and the rule and reign of God, as well as a naturalistic perspective on life, are both things we're going to dive into heavily tonight.
Awesome. I'm excited.
Yes.
Do you want to take it away then, talking about Ecclesiastes?
Absolutely. So this book, Jade, you mentioned that it's heavy, and many people kind of get depressed after reading it, I think. And while that makes sense, I would like to argue tonight that I think a lot of those sentiments come from a misunderstanding of the purpose of the book and exactly how we're reading it, as I think is the case with a lot of scripture, really, that the way we approach the text and how we understand the context of it really affects the way we understand it.
For sure.
To get into the context here, if we look at the first verse here, it says it's the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, this first line here, looking in chapter 1, and for all aware, I'm reading out of the English Standard Version as well, that there has been a lot of debate about the authorship of this book and who exactly wrote it. Now, that word for the preacher in the Hebrew, the word is koheleth. That basically just means speaker, or preacher is an appropriate translation. It's implied in the word that it's the preacher to some type of assembly as well. So, however, when it says the son of David, king in Jerusalem, would imply son of David being someone of the Davidic line ruling in Jerusalem. So because of that, as well as what is described in the book, it's been mostly accepted that the author of the book is King Solomon. However, some have argued, based on the writing style of the book, that it comes from a later date. Some have argued that it came from the time of King Hezekiah, possibly from Hezekiah himself.
Wow. So we don't actually know what the date is on this book.
It's not clearly identifiable.
Gotcha.
But I would argue that I think based on when we read through it, it's very difficult, if we believe the author to be writing about things that factually happened, that this could be anybody other than King Solomon. I think it, just as in the cases we often see, for those who don't know, there's a lot of debate nowadays about the content of the book of Job, too, about whether it actually happened. That I think, in the same way that if you look at Job and you treat it as just metaphor and something that didn't really happen, how it takes away from a lot of the power of the book.
Oh, yeah.
If we look at the book of Ecclesiastes as well and say, well, the things that the preacher is describing, they didn't really exactly happen. He didn't really go on this quest that he's going to describe. He's really just using it all as metaphor. That's allegory. I think that takes away from much of the power of the book, and I just don't think it's accurate. It doesn't make sense. It's not necessary. So it is my opinion that the author is absolutely Solomon. I'm going to refer to the author as Solomon.
Okay.
And if anyone has any thoughts about that, I would love to hear about them and discuss that too.
You know, it's funny, if it is Solomon, I'm looking at even chapter 1, and like the header later on is "Wisdom is meaningless," and it's funny because he was so wise. And if this really is Solomon writing this, he's saying even that is meaningless.
Well, exactly, that is part of the huge emphasis about what makes this book so powerful and why it makes so much sense for it to be Solomon, and the ways that he's going to describe wisdom and its attributes coming from someone who may have been one of the most, if not the most, wise person to ever live, really adds a lot of power to the way he speaks about it.
Right.
And I will add on that note that it is worth noting going into this too, especially in this question of Solomonic authorship, that some have posited that Solomon wrote this at the end of his life when he, the Bible never describes him kind of coming around to a moment of repentance.
Right.
The farthest we see is him kind of being lost in all of his sinful passions. But if the author is Solomon, the way he writes, it would seem to indicate that he may have arrived at some point of really seeing the futility of all of his sinful efforts, and that this was really his letter of repentance in many ways. I won't say that for certain, but I do think that makes a lot of sense, and that if you read it that way, it does add a lot to the book.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah. So that's part of the context on authorship, as well as date. If we do believe it's Solomon, we can date it to around the time of his reign. Mm-hmm. So let's hop into, we just dove through the first line of verse 1 here. We're going to look at verse 2 and 3 here, is to kind of trace some more of the context for the discussion. The text reads, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun?" So, another note on language here. The word vanity here is extremely important for the sake of our discussion tonight about understanding what it actually means. The word in Hebrew is hebel. It's the literal translation of the word is vapor, mist. You will see the NIV most prominently translated this as meaningless.
Yeah, that's
the NASB, the ESV put it as vanity. Mm-hmm. For reasons that I think make sense, in that we can see from the first verses here, Solomon doesn't define what this vanity is. We're more so going to learn what it is by his descriptions, that he's going to go through it. But the image that you want to hold in your mind as we go through here tonight is the image of this vapor, this mist of something that's there, but then it's not, and you try to get it, and it gets away from you. Okay. That's the concept that he's trying to go after here.
Right.
Now, when he says vanity of vanities, and he says it twice, what this is resembling is it's comparable to the phrase that we see throughout the Old Testament when it's, we describe the inner part of the tabernacle as the Holy of Holies. Mm-hmm. This is a common literary strategy in Hebrew writing, that repetition is used to emphasize the seriousness of a concept.
I have heard that.
So I think it would add to our understanding here about how serious Solomon is about what he's seeking to posit here, that in the same way the phrase Holy of Holies emphasizes this center place in the tabernacle that is so holy that a person can't even go in there without a rope on their ankle in case they die. Solomon is serious in that life itself, in his eye, is the greatest vanity of vanities, that of all the fleeting, vaporous, meaningless, if you would say, things, life is the greatest of them. So he's very serious about this concept.
You see the weight of this book. We haven't even gotten through the first chapter yet.
Right from the
first
beginning. 3 verses. So that's verse 2. Now, verse 3 really is the center verse we want to focus on for what we're going to walk through the rest of the book. In that, what Solomon is doing here, at least in the beginning of the book, which is where we're going to spend most of our time today, it's comparable in many ways for those of you who have been through college and have written a term paper, where you have a thesis that you're seeking to argue, and then you give the evidence for it. So Solomon's thesis that he's attempting to argue here is that the toil, at which all toil under the sun, that phrase meaning the natural world that we exist within, is vanity. And that is what he is now going to attempt to prove through this first section of the book. So my goal tonight is to walk alongside this journey with King Solomon about understanding and working through his arguments about why life is vanity, and to take some analysis to see if we agree with them and what we think of them, and to ultimately come to the place of analyzing the conclusion that he comes to.
Awesome.
Cool.
Let's do it.
So we're going to skip over this first chunk here. This is Solomon's first argument about vanity. He just kind of talks about some of the rhythms of the natural world. We're going to pass there for now, and we're going to we're going to hop all the way to chapter 2 and start there. So this first chunk that Solomon is going to attempt to argue his thesis of vanity based on worldly pleasure and achievement. So keeping that in mind, we are going to read through the first 12 verses here and then take some analysis over them.
Okay.
So I'll read through them. I said in my heart, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself." But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, "It is mad." And of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great, and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. And we're actually going to stop there. We're not going to read 11 yet.
Okay.
We're going to analyze it first. Okay. So, first I want to look at the very first part of chapter 2, when he says, I said in my heart. Now, this is something that we do in our Friday class too in biblical literacy, and that I think makes sense here, that an important part to being able to read the Bible well is to understand what authors mean with the terms they're using. So it's worth noting that the term heart is a word that we use often in our culture, and we use it to kind of mean our emotions, our feelings, and many things like that. Now, sometimes the scripture does mean something comparable to that when it uses that word. Other times it doesn't. And many times, actually, the use of the word heart is more similar to what we would use for the term of our head, that the authors of Scripture use heart to describe the place where one thought and reasoned and that they're thinking from.
Right.
So, however, in this instance, really, it's kind of a little bit of both. And that really what he's trying to get at with heart is saying, I said in my inner man, in the most essential part of me, that Solomon was fully resolved that what he was about to embark on, he was going to fully quest himself towards, that he was fully resolved to go on this path.
Okay.
That's where he's aimed. Now, also want to focus on verse 3, when he said, I searched my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me. That it's important in this whole section to note that while we're going to look at some of the ways that Solomon really went off on his quest to stretch pleasure to its natural limit, when he says, my heart's still guiding me, and he's going to repeat this later, that in this whole quest, he wants his reader to take note that he did not just lose himself completely. He didn't just become an animal and was guided by his senses. That even though he was indulging in these pleasures, many of which would kind of fully seize control of us, that he still had his self-control, that he was doing it for a reason, which I think adds to the validity of the arguments that he's going to make. So let's hold on to that.
Okay.
Okay, so he goes through a couple different categories of the stimulation that he goes through here. Now, most of them are relatively self-explanatory here, but we'll walk through these. So the first part, starting in verse 2. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is this? Maybe we'll get back to in verse 3. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. So first part of Solomon's journey was to stir himself with this physical stimulation, to indulge in alcohol and the food going with that and all the other things that might stimulate a person physically. That's stimulation number one, stimulation by substance. Where we see Solomon spill most of his ink here, though, which I think is really worth meditating on, that the majority of his quest in this pleasure is not this physical stimulation, it's more so an emotional stimulation by achievement. Consider some of the things that he says here. We look at verse 4. He made great works, built houses and planted vineyards, made himself pools, bought slaves for himself, gathered silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. To such a way in verse 9, he says, I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. If there has ever been anybody in the history of the world who has been at the top of their career chain, who has reached their apex vocationally, it was King Solomon. He was the top dog, having one of the most profitable, wealthy, stable kingdoms that the world has ever seen, which I really want us to hold fast to, especially, I just urge everyone listening to, in our American culture, we are constantly pushed to achieve more and be better and to get to the top of the pyramid and get that promotion as if there's something waiting there for you. So think about that and consider what you think that you might do or what you've seen others do. Solomon did tenfold. So hold on to the conclusion that he's going to draw.
Oh, man.
So that's stimulation by achievement. And lastly, I'd really call it stimulation by everything. Look at verse 10. He says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for my toil. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. And this is one reason why I think confirming Solomonic authorship is so important, that if we read that and we try to attribute to this someone other than Solomon, it's hard to say that this is really true that it happened. But if we do believe that this is Solomon writing, we have every reason to believe that Solomon isn't being facetious here, that he was a man of such great power and wealth and influence, he really could have whatever his eyes wanted. He had it all. That whatever his heart wanted and desired, he got. Now think about that for a minute. put yourself in that position. Think about all the things that you're longing for right now, that you want, that are stressing you out, that are annoying you. Imagine if you had them. Think about it. Think about that for a minute.
I can't.
It is hard, right?
Yeah.
But I imagine there's some level of joy, right? About, man, if I just had that house that I wanted, or I got that new car, or that promotion at work, or I got to go to a different job, or if my family members stopped being so annoying. Man, those are all things that I'm sure Solomon did in his quest for pleasure. He had the baddest camel and the nicest palace and all of that. Now, keep that in mind, and now we read verse 11. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun.
That's harsh.
The image that comes to me when I read that is I picture King Solomon maybe standing out on the balcony of his palace, looking over his great city, maybe after a night of crazy reveling, and he's seen all of his buildings and all of his harem and everything that he has, looking over all of it, and just realizing none of it really matters. I did it all, and it's still meaningless. I'm not fulfilled. Man, can you imagine that type of weight? But that is exactly what waits when you finally get that carrot on a stick that you've been chasing after. Is, man, there's really nothing there. He's going to lay into this more.
Man.
So, we're now going to... I still stapled my notes backwards.
Oh, man.
And I flipped them last time. Okay. I do want to try to leave us with this encouragement, and this is something I'd like to try to hold on to, that I think so much of our stress in life comes from these idols that we don't even consciously realize we have, and that until we get to the point that Solomon got here, and like he's really going to get to later, we're going to continue to be so stressed out and anxious. And I just think it's a crazy thing. The ways that Satan plays with our mind are absolutely unbelievable. But can you think about the thing that you want? Maybe the issue isn't that you don't have it. The issue isn't that your circumstances aren't different. The issue is that you want it. In and of itself. That the issue isn't that annoying person at work, or that you can't get the car, or you're having this issue or that issue. The issue is how much you want those things to change. The issue is where your heart is in the matter.
That's really interesting.
Okay. So now, I'm not going to really exegete too far this next section, but I do want to read through this and meditate on verses 12 to 17 for a minute. So let's read through that after I take a drink. Why don't you read it, Jade?
Okay, I have a different translation. I'm reading from the NIV.
Maybe you shouldn't then, because it's probably going to mess with it. Okay.
It's okay. It's all meaningless, right, Matt?
It is all meaningless. Okay. Starting in verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in all the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. Okay, what I want to grab from this section is that some may respond to what I said in that first section by saying, well, I'm I'm not chasing those idols. I really am not trying to chase after all these sensual pleasures and achievement. I recognize that those things don't really hold value. So they try to go to a higher philosophical realm. You know, an individual like Jordan Peterson comes to mind for me. Someone who I admire very much and just has a lot of sound thinking of the world, but people like him and so many other philosophers have this idea that, man, if they can just think through things hard enough, that they'll be able to get it.
Right.
Right? And I think the point that Solomon makes here, first, which is worth meditating on, is he does recognize there is value in wisdom. That it is better to take a path of wisdom than of darkness.
Right.
But it's still ultimately meaningless.
Yeah.
Because the wise person, for all their wisdom, dies and falls into the same grave as the fool.
Exactly.
So what really is the worth of it at the end of the day?
Right.
So, wise living, moral living, is ultimately also vanity. And you can see it's really starting to get to Solomon a little bit here. You see in verse 17, right? I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. So let's, if we hold on to this image of King Solomon sitting on his porch, he's done all the physical stimulation. He went in, tried to think through everything and be wise, then came back out and realized it still doesn't work. So now he's getting really agitated on the porch. So now, in my mind of King Solomon's journey, right, he's going to try to go walk out to a field next to Jerusalem and being like, man, maybe if I just do a little bit of farm work and just do some physical labor, that is where I'm going to find the satisfaction, right? Just do something menial and physical, that'll be good. That's where it's at, right?
Right.
You can probably guess where it's going to go. Let's dig into it. Okay, so we're going to just read verse 18 and 19 to start with. I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So, Solomon went out, tried to do the labor, came back to his porch, and realized, wow, this is meaningless too. Because no matter what I build, no matter how many great construction projects I do, I'm going to die.
Yeah.
And he can't avoid the fact of death. It's just
Right.
constantly haunting him, and he can't get away. And that who knows what's going to become of it. So what the heck is the point of doing any of it to begin with?
Yeah. Can I just take a detour?
Yeah.
And this is kind of deep, but we're in deep.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was in high school, maybe even middle school a little bit, I kind of came to this, I don't know why, this thought of, one day, looking around my bedroom, one day in the future, this building, my home, is probably not going to be here anymore.
Huh?
All the times I cried or was joyful and laughed in this room, all those memories will be gone with this building, and no one will remember the building, and no one will remember me or my family. I was young, and I'm just I was not a Christian, and I was just going through these thoughts of, wow, why? You know what I mean? Literally everything will pass away. And I don't know why, I haven't thought about that in a very long time, but that's something I used to think about all the time.
Yeah.
Is something, here, someone's going to take over, and it doesn't matter, they could be foolish, they could be anything but wise, and all your work, all your life will not matter.
Yeah.
So go on, sorry.
Just chasing after the wind. I mean, that's
Literally.
it really is an astute comment, Jade, because I
Yeah.
do think that's nagging at the back of all of our minds. I think we're just so busy chasing the carrot most of the time that we're able
Right.
to kind of push it away.
Right.
And that it's only when we realize the carrot is really a piece of dung and it's not anything worth chasing after that we're able to see, oh God, it is all meaningless. That suddenly when you lose the idol you've been chasing and you're forced to confront reality, it starts to get dark, because that is the truth of the matter, is that it
Yeah.
will all pass away.
And that's the thing, so many people, they just try to stick to what they have here on this earth because they don't want to think past, or they don't, you know what I mean? They're literally hanging on with everything they got.
Yeah, it's like somebody tumbling through a field of mist to work with our vanity. The word being literally vapor, that you could just keep trying to crawl through the mist field, and as soon as your hand touches something, it fades away. But hey, there's a mist in front of me, and more and more,
going, yep.
and you can never lay hold of it, but there's always more to be chased, even though you never have it, and then eventually you just die.
Right.
So we'll get there, though.
Yeah,
We'll get there, though, but that's a great comment, just to realize that these things are where we all do naturally get.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we'll look at 20 to 23. So my heading for this little section is this is where Solomon really breaks. This is where he's walked through this whole journey, right? He tried pleasure, riches, great building projects. He tried being wise. He tried just general labor and toil, and he's realized it's all worthless. It's not going to satisfy him, and this is his conclusion on the whole matter. And I think this is really one of, if not the most important section of the text. So really listen to what he says here. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. So he's kind of come face to face with it, right? I think it's just a particularly striking when you picture in 20, I turned about and gave my heart up to despair. You know, I think we've all had similar times like that where the reality of life kind of crashes up against us and we're trying to keep going, and then you just can't.
Yeah.
And then despair just kind of washes over you, and
Yep.
you just fall into the cynicism and gosh, why? What is all this for?
Right.
And I think that what we read right here, as painful as it may be, is something that as Christians, or really as people who are Christians or who would hope to be Christians, this is a place that we have to get to if we are ever going to correctly understand God and the gospel in our Christian life here, is you must come to a point where you realize, as in 23, at the end of the day, all our days are full of sorrow, work is a vexation, and there's no rest without God. That this life, in and of itself, that's the only place it will eventually lead you. No matter how far you get on the career scale, no matter how great of a relationship you get, no matter how beautiful the guy or beautiful the girl or dashing the guy, no matter what achieve. I mean, think about it. I'm sure you are thinking about it right now because we live in it. What is the desire of your heart? What is going on with your job or your relationship or your studies? Think about it. And realize, please realize, it's vanity. It's meaningless, and it won't satisfy. Even if you got that thing, there's another thing. And then you get that, it won't take you there. And you have to get there before you can properly understand what Solomon is about to understand about God. So think about that for a minute.
You got me thinking about it, and I can't right now. Oh my
Pause
goodness.
There. Pause there. And if anybody has any comments, feel free to add.
Yes, please do. He's laying it in deep right now.
We'll keep going now. Okay. So then, now that Solomon has really worked through this, I think he gets to really the truth and the heart of the matter. That now, after basically hitting rock bottom, coming to the truth of the matter, this is what he starts to realize. Starting in 24, going to 26. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also, I saw, is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. So, first thing I want to just note here is in the language here. Okay, so where it says there's nothing better for a person and he should eat and drink and find, that word find is the amalgamation of two Hebrew words. I didn't exactly, but the first Hebrew word, if you look at the NASB here, it translates it as there's nothing better than for a person to tell himself that his labor is good, versus find. And I think the idea of what the words are really getting at there is this is talking about the essence of contentment. And I think what those words there are trying to communicate, which is us to hold on to start with, and why the NASB translates as tell himself, is that this isn't just something that you stumble upon and you find. That if to eat and drink, rather to find enjoyment, is something you have to like intentionally seek. Like the enjoyment in labor isn't just there. We'll exposit this further. I just wanted to note that on the language, that there's more behind there. So, consider all that we just read, right? All is really vanity in and of itself. It's meaningless. It's not going to ultimately satisfy. Ultimately. But, if it's noted as being from the hand of God, that without him there's no eating or having enjoyment, but to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, there's more. And I think this is the heart of Ecclesiastes, really of so much of the gospel, that drinking wine and having relationships and great building projects and toil in the field and wisdom are all good things. They're not bad. Did they come from Satan? No. Satan can't create anything. God made wine. He made our bodies. He made relationships. He made labor. He made all these things. The issue is when we look to them for ultimate satisfaction instead of looking to God as being the ultimate source of our joy and enjoying all these good gifts in light of him. But here is the beautiful part, that when you understand that, there's nothing better than to eat and drink and find enjoyment. The fact there is enjoyment. I mean, look at the contrast from what we just read earlier. Work has gone from being a vexation to enjoyment. What changed? God. He understood these things are not ultimately fulfilling. They're not something I'm just going to chase and get myself. They're gifts from the hand of God.
Right.
And now, here is the blessing of that life, my brothers and sisters. That with this, there's wisdom and knowledge and joy. When that relationship you're chasing, or that career change, or that job or pay, or all of these things, when you can approach them as blessings, as things that are good gifts from God, instead of being something you have to have, it changes everything.
Right.
To be a blessing from your God.
That's so true.
And then the contrast is without that, to the sinner, he's given the business of gathering and collecting. That without that proper motivation, you're just walking around life trying to work and labor and gather and build, as he said, only to give it away to somebody else.
So what does that mean there? Because it says, but to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God.
I will confess, I'm not entirely sure about that last phrase. It's a little bit confusing. My best conjecture, as I've thought about this, is it's maybe referring... I think it's similar to what we often see in the Psalms, that they often speak about how God will vanquish the wicked and give victory to his people, and that these things sometimes have their manifestation in a physical sense, but always have their manifestation in an eternal sense as well. That ultimately the wicked will give over all they have to the saints when Christ comes and returns and achieves final victory. Although sometimes the wicked do give over what they have to those who walk righteously and in wisdom and rightly with God. So I think it's really meant to be a little bit both of those. That is a general wisdom principle that righteous, godly living generally does find victory over wicked living. But even when that doesn't happen, in an eternal sense, the wicked ultimately don't get to keep anything they have, and the righteous will inherit the earth.
So we do have a comment.
Oh, really?
And he says, basically, if you're not content with what God has provided, you're chasing the wind.
Amen. Amen. Absolutely. Contentment is the heart of this book.
And you know what's funny? Months back, me and you were talking about sin and what is like the ultimate sin, or I forget how we worded it, but we've heard it said that greed, right? Greed is like the ultimate drive for every sin.
Yeah.
And so we were like thinking and brainstorming, like, what is the complete opposite of greed? And I was like, oh, like, what did I say? Like, pleasure or something, like, not pleasure. I forget what I said, but it wasn't good enough. And he was like, no, it's contentment. And since then, I've not forgot that. And it's so hard sometimes, to be content. And
Absolutely.
I mean, this is literally telling us right here, like, that is the point of it.
Yeah.
Man.
Absolutely, Jade. Now we're about to make a little bit of a switch in the text and what it refers to, but just before we switch, just so we can continue to thinking about this, I do just want to offer 2 practical examples about how this has even affected me today.
Yeah.
I just moved into a new place.
Right.
I'm in a place in Ewing, and it's nice. I'm happy to be in my own place, but like, I have my complaints about the neighborhood or where I'm at and the traffic and all this stuff. And I found myself on Zillow earlier in the day. I was looking at different properties and being like, man, like if I could go here or here, like that would be great. And as I worked through this, I was driving back up to my house, getting ready to change and get ready for here. And it just made me pause based on all the things that I had just written and be like, wow, I'm so grateful to be here. It's not wrong for me to want these changes, but I just realized how much of my heart was occupied while I was thinking about that. Or even I'm making a commute 3 times a week, about an hour and a half out to PA. I spend a lot of times on the turnpike, and I have a decent car, but when I'm trying to do 80 in it struggles a little bit.
Aww.
So I'm like, man, like if I could just have like a nice car that could run smoothly down the turnpike and all this and that. And I'm like, man, like how much energy do I spend thinking about these things? Why does this matter? Because that's the heart of it, I think, is that chasing after these idols is just such a waste. And it's ultimately, I'll get that house or I'll get that car. And if I don't change my mindset about the matter, I'm just going to want the next car or the next house.
Right.
That's the sinister thing about the whole thing, which is what Solomon's getting at. So those are 2 things that stuck with me. So like I said, I really do I hope this is a practical session, that this book is meant to affect us in the way it comes across. And I would encourage you to continue thinking about these things as we go through here.
For sure.
So we're now going to flip into chapter 3. And I'm going to flip to the other side of my backwards notes. Okay. So this first 1 to 8 here in chapter 3 is probably the most famous section of the book. And I'm actually going to spend no time on it. I'm not even going to read through it.
No, read it for yourselves.
I will just say part of that is, as I thought about going through it, there's really a lot more there than you realize. And I think it would just take a little bit more time to teach through than is appropriate tonight. So we're going to skip there, and we're going to work through 9 to 14 here. So I'm going to read through the chunk here. And understand this isn't divorced from what we just read. It's a continuation of the same thought that Solomon has kind of had this revelation about the role of God in the midst of all the toil. And now what we're about to read is kind of an understanding of how God's nature works into this equation. So keep that in mind. What gain has a worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceived that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. And first we're going to pause there before I read verse 14. So again, I talked in the beginning of this about how Ecclesiastes can come across as such a depressing book so often. This is where the hope is meant to come in. That chapter 2 has to be as depressing as it is, so that this can be beautiful. If you don't understand that everything else is meaningless, when he finally starts to talk about what is meaningful, you won't get the sense of it. But now, look at this. A life that is so vain and frustrating on its surface, when you can understand it as not being penultimate, and when he says everything beautiful in its time, it's meant to be a callback. He just did this whole poem about time. That now we can walk through a world. Okay, you know what? Actually, I'm going to read verse 14, because that's...
Sure.
I'm sorry. I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Okay, the reason I went there is because this whole understanding that Solomon lays out in 9 and 13, that it's good to eat and drink, take pleasure in God's gifts, see everything is beautiful in time, the bedrock of that is verse 14 and 15. Now, understand the contrast here. He's been talking about, if you understand just the image, right, of mist that's fleeting away, you can't lay hold of it, and then he says, whatever God does endures forever. So, right, it's like suddenly you're going through the mist and your hand like runs into a brick wall, right? And that's God. That's revelation. When you're clawing and clawing and clawing and suddenly just ram your head into the brick wall and realize, whoa, there is something solid in the midst of that. Yes. And suddenly the mist and the vapor can be meaningful because you have something solid to anchor yourself against. That because he is reliable and firm and doesn't change, and you can hold on to that, and then while enjoying the vapor, suddenly the vapor has meaning. Because it's not what you're clinging to. You're clinging to God. And everything can be beautiful. Now, I do just also want to touch, at the very end of 15, I don't really like the way the ESV translates this.
Do you want me to read my version?
I don't actually like the way the NIV translates it either.
Oh, dang it.
Okay, you know what? I don't actually think I wrote down the translation that I liked. Isn't that ironic?
That is.
But I think I liked how the King James had put it. It's something like, why don't you read the NIV? Maybe I'm wrong about this, Jade. What do you have on verse...
15?
Verse 15.
Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account.
Okay, no, that is what I like. That is
Bingo.
What I like. Okay, because it's like the ESV like translates it kind of literally, and what has been driven away. In that, it also is kind of a tricky phrase. In that, it does kind of say like it's about like. Gosh, it's really hard to describe. Basically, the essence of the principle about what's being described here in 15, that really, and it's important, I'm spending this much time on it because it's important for the whole thing, is that what has been and what will be is there because God spoke it into existence. That when we understand the vapor is there by God's design, and ultimately, the vapor does have meaning. It all matters because God is going to call it to account. That he's going to take our actions and all that is done and in this world being things that he laid out, and he will bring them to bear. They matter to him. So that really anchors the whole... Because without that, how can you have anything but nihilism? Without a sovereign God who really does watch over the world and cares about the events, what does it matter?
Literally nothing matters. Like, moralism doesn't matter. Like, why do we even have laws? Why don't we just, literally do whatever we want, anytime we want, all the time?
Yep. We're always going to die anyway, right?
Right.
But God is eternal. He endures forever. So the one who endures forever is the lawgiver and judge. He's the one judging, not mortal human judges.
Good.
So that's why, it's so crucial. You have to get this. Or life is meaningless.
Right.
Okay. So now we are going to skip. This is really the essence. I think that the preacher has really proved his point, at
Right.
least in my opinion. I think he's made a persuasive case that it's all meaningless. He's argued God's role in it. And the rest of the book is really kind of, it's more proverbial in many ways, and a lot of it's just general guidance for living in this challenging world. And it's valuable, but the first bit there is really the essence of his argument.
Right.
So now we're going to skip actually all the way to chapter 12 to the end, and what's kind of like the epilogue of the
right.
book when he's recapping the whole sum of what he's written here. So this is 13 verses, kind of similar to the poem at the beginning of 3. The first 8 verses are very poetic, and they kind of speak for themselves. So I'm going to read it, but I'm not really going to teach through them. I would just note that when I read through them, this is meant to all be descriptions of death in one form or another. They're descriptions of someone reaching the end of their life, and they're kind of poetic ways to describe that. So we're going to read through the first 8 verses. I'll pause, and then we'll read through the rest of it.
Gotcha.
Okay, this is Ecclesiastes chapter 12, starting in verse 1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders seize because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low, they are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. And then 9 to 13. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil.
Oh, man.
Shoo!
So, I have a question, and I'm not sure if you're going to get to it, but I'm just going to throw it at you. What is a goad?
So a goad is, from what I understand in my research, it was a long pointed stick that farmers would use to guide oxen along the right way. Kind of like something they would smack the oxen with to help them go in the direction they were supposed to go in.
Okay, so I just want to read verse 11 again with that, with knowing what a goad is. You do your version, because I know you prefer yours.
The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. So it's, nails firmly fixed is an image that we have more familiarity with, that the words of the wise, just like a nail firm there that isn't moving, it's like this goad that guides you along the right path, that is firm, it's steadfast. And it's given by the one shepherd.
Right.
Okay, so what I want to meditate, as I said, I think the first section is kind of self-explanatory in what it says, and the essence of what that first chunk is getting at, and what's recapping at the end here, is everything the book has taught about the general vanity and meaningless and chasing after the wind. Don't wait to embrace it, because eventually you're going to get to all those things that it described when you're at the end of your life and you're weak and weary and you've suddenly wasted your whole life chasing things that didn't matter.
Right.
It's saying, don't get there. Stop right now and stop chasing the wind. Remember your creator now. That's the first part. And then it makes the notes about, again, these is more evidence, I think, for why this is Solomon, in that the proverb, when it says arranging many proverbs with great care, we see almost, I don't know what the right word is, there's evidence in the beginning of Proverbs and throughout it that you almost can't argue against that they were written by Solomon. So I think this is obviously talking about the preacher doing it. It's Solomon. So I think, again, that's more evidence that the author is definitely Solomon. Now, I really want to make a note on verse 12 and how that... I know my friend Justin likes to talk about verse breaks often. 12 to 13 is another one where the verse break really, I don't think is too appropriate, because they're really thoughts that should be joined together. And that, when it says, beware of anything beyond these, of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Do you remember we talked about earlier in chapter 2 that Solomon warned against, or rather just said that he tried this whole wisdom thing, right? And to try to figure it all out on his own, and he found it didn't work. It's vanity. I think what he's urging here is, and I think this is a good exhortation to everyone listening too, is not that you shouldn't weigh what you've heard and think through it, but don't overthink it. That we can study and think and think and think and think and think. But what Solomon says here, right in 13, the end of the matter, it's all been heard. Fear God and keep his commands. That's it. You don't need to keep going and studying and searching and researching. I tried it. I did it. I tried everything. This is the truth. Fear God. That's it. And
that's hard.
It is hard, right? And also, again, I don't want to argue against study and such, but just to say, not that you shouldn't, but you got to limit yourself too, because that's part of the idolatry that he warned against here, is when you think that there's this, if you can just study hard enough, you'll get it. He says it's not there.
Right.
This is the truth. Fear God. That's it. Obey him. And again, I think we would do well when he says that he's talking about the sayings of the preacher. They're given by the one shepherd. Again, just a little interesting tidbit here. We often hear the argument, well, isn't Scripture just sayings of people here? Well, look, he's talking about the book of Proverbs here in some way, as well as the writings here. He says they're the words of the wise, but they're given by the one shepherd. That they come from God to human authors.
Right.
Again, more powerful internal evidence for Scripture. Okay, something that is really, really, really important here. In verse 13, it says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. The word duty there is not in the original text.
Really?
Anywhere. Like I said, there's literally not a word there. It just says, for this is the whole of man. In that, it's not as if, oh man, like, because this is the heart of the book. Because this is how you flip it around. You say all is vanity, it's all meaningless. So instead, I'm going to make this legalistic obedience to God the thing I'm going to chase after. And if you're just completely destroying all the work that Solomon just did, if you did that, and I think this line is just beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful to me. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole of man. This is your life. This is your being. This is all that is good and right and true, is obeying God. It's not a burdensome, taxing thing. This is your life, is obeying God and fearing him, your creator, as it just testified, right?
Right. And that will actually make you whole.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and really, and verse 14, I think, just closes this so fittingly. This is exactly what we saw earlier at the end of 3 about the thing that your translation said about how he'll call everything to account.
Right.
He's repeating his point. Why do you fear God and keep his commandments, other than it being your all? Remember, for God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So as much as you want to wander off and say to hell with it all the time and just act like it's all meaningless, God does not see that way.
Right.
And when you go act out in your wild disobedience and sin, it's not forgotten by God. But by the same token, your fear and discomfort and the pain that comes from saying, gosh, I'm done, is also seen by God. And there is a better way. It's not to be found through moralistic philosophy. It's not to be found through hedonistic pleasure. It's not to be found through career advancement. And please hear me on that one, because that is our God here in the United States. It is the God of career. It's not there. Please hear me. It's not there. But God is. So fear God, obey his commandments, and enjoy all of your efforts with joy, because they are gifts from God when enjoyed appropriately.
Oh, man. Well, Matt, you have certainly given us a lot to chew on, and, a push to read this book again in my early future. Man, thank you so much for coming on and doing this study. I know you probably had so much fun because I know it's one of your favorite books. I thank you for just sharing this information and this wisdom with us from the book of Ecclesiastes. Without, much more to say, I guess we can then wrap it up for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and please hold on to this message, hold on to Scripture, and hold on to God. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone.